Okay, Razib Khan.
Hey, what's up?
Thanks so much for coming on our show.
My pleasure.
So I've been aware of you for a long time, and I've been enjoying your Substack recently, which is really excellent. You have these long, deep articles about population genetics and what it can tell us about history, and we're going to get into all of that. But before we do, can you give my audience a little bit of your bio? Like, how did you get into population genetics as a field, and maybe we could talk a little bit about what you're up to these days, because I know you're out of academia now.
Yeah. So, I'm fairly typical in, let's say, first generation children of immigrants. So I was born in Bangladesh. I moved here when I just turned 5. I grew up in upstate New York, and then I spent most of my, I'd say, formative years, adolescence in Oregon, Eastern Oregon, Western Oregon. I went to University of Oregon. I majored in biochemistry, which is what you do when you're pre-med. And then I realized I want to do medicine, and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I added a biology major with a focus on genetics. I didn't really know much about genetics, but I knew I was kind of interested in it. And I'd always been interested in evolution. To really understand evolution, you need to understand genetics, right? And so this was the 1990s, and genetics was hot. I mean, this was when the Human Genome Project was happening. So that was always on my mind. Initially, I worked in IT. I did some programming, database developing, and stuff like that, because I didn't really want to spend time on a bench, okay? Like, working with a pipette and stuff like that. And that's what biologists do, or that's what molecular biologists do. And that was what my training was. And then I realized, what I really like is more like mathematical modeling, understanding evolution using allele frequencies. It's basically population genetics. I had a little bit of training in that. I went back and got a little bit of more training, some post-baccalaureate work. And then I went to graduate school at UC Davis. My interest, my PhD topic of interest was actually like domestication and quantitative evolution of domestic dogs, domestic cats, and stuff like that. So I was really interested in what human civilization had done to animals that we had domesticated, or that were pets, or that lived with us. And that brings me to a second interest, which I've had, which, I think you've seen in my Substack. I'm really interested in human history and the human past. And this is not actually that surprising. I know a lot of people in STEM who have thought about majoring in history, and they're like, I'm just going to major in STEM. And I don't know why that is. I think it's because there's a lot of facts, and it's just an interesting topic. It's just like story of our species. And so basically over the last 10 years, the field of paleogenetics has emerged. And so paleogenetics is basically taking ancient DNA. So not DNA from, we're alive, but say DNA from someone that died 10,000 years ago, and then sequencing it and getting all the information out. And just so your listeners have a clear understanding, we really understood or tracked like a couple of hundred genes in the human genome. And it wasn't even called the human genome then, like 30 years ago, right? So it's pretty amazing that you can take a whole genome of 19,000 genes from someone that died 10,000 years ago now. So we've come orders and orders of magnitude. So the reason I write so much about population genetics and ancient DNA and history on my Substack is there's a lot of questions that used to be open questions that have been answered by these paleogenetic methods. Obviously, they can't answer everything. Like, okay, like what was, the theological difference, of this particular sect in Anatolia? Okay, that's not a genetic question. But when people say, concretely, okay, so the modern Greeks are not descended from the ancient Greeks at all. Well,
is that right?
Well, that's actually wrong.
Oh, that's wrong.
But that was something that people started saying in the 19th century, because what happened?
So on what basis did they say that?
The basis is basically, and I have a Substack post on this, so people out there can look it up. But what happened in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, is classically educated Western Europeans, and particularly English, like Lord Byron, British people, show up in Greece to help them with their revolution against the Ottoman Turks. And they did succeed. But one of the things that happened is they were like shocked at what the modern Greeks are like, because they are not what's described in Herodotus or Thucydides or Homer, because that's what they knew of the Greeks. And so
they're not sitting around, drawing triangles and formulas and
okay. Modern Greeks, like, from their perception,
Socrates and Pythagoras.
Yeah, we're an Oriental people, whereas the ancient Greeks are obviously a Western people. And I'm not saying like that's literally true, but I'm saying this is what their perception was.
Right.
The ancient Greeks are the cultural ancestors of the West. So how can these people, these kind of like feuding, argumentative, Oriental, Middle Eastern looking people be the descendants of the ancient Greeks? So the hypothesis is, well, these are not the descendants of the ancient Greeks. What happened during the Roman Empire was a bunch of slaves came in from Syria and replaced the ancient Greeks. So that's the hypothesis, right? Modern genetics to show that's not really true. Actually, I have a separate post on this, but basically, slaves have very, very, very like subnormal fertility in the vast majority of the world for the vast majority of history. So slaves actually don't leave much of an imprint,
right?
Because they don't have children, and in fact,
they were often castrated in the
the eunuchs were, but
in the Arab world,
actually before the Arab world. And the Byzantines had castrados too, and obviously the Romans, right? So that was a common thing. But even if the children were born in the classical period, infanticide was socially acceptable. And so they would just take the infant, because infants are, like if you're talking about economic calculation, infants are a net sink. And so they would kill the infants if the slaves ended up having. So slaves tried not to have children because they knew that the infants often would be killed or exposed anyway. So the slaves didn't have offspring, and so modern Greeks are mostly descended from ancient Greeks. They do have some ancestry that's new, and that's actually Slavic ancestry. And I see this, I've actually looked at the data. I see it everywhere in Greece, especially in northern Greece, obviously. But so like say like 5 to 25% Slavic ancestry from after like around like 580 to 600 AD, the Byzantine Empire basically.
So when you see, so when you get a bunch of genomes from modern day Greek people, you see shared genes with current Slavic people. How do you date those? How do you know that it's 500 AD?
Sure. Well, we know it's 500 AD because the Byzantines took good records. And so there's a group of, I think they call them the Scalveni, and they're basically Slavs. And they show up with the Avar Empire. The Avars were Turks, but the majority of people that lived under them were not Turks. They were mostly Slavs who came from what we would call like Moravia, southern Poland, etc. And they started moving southward. So before 600 AD, so, you guys know that Yugoslavia, all that former region, Bulgaria, these are Slavic languages, but those regions were not Slavic speaking. The western part of the Balkans was more like Albanian, Illyrian speaking, and the eastern part, like in Bulgaria, was actually Latin speaking. And so that all changed after that period. So we know this from history in terms of the Scalveni didn't show up until after about 600 AD, and then they just percolated all through, Greece, the interior. Obviously in the north, the Republic of Macedonia northward, there was cultural shift in terms of now they speak a Slavic language. Genetically, they look to be about like 30 to 50% Slavic. So there was much more substantial replacement there. But in Greece, you see it's more like 5 to 25%. But I mean, aside from the historical records, I can just tell you, okay, you pull someone who's a genome from say 1200 BC. Okay, like this is like a real example. You compare their genotype, you compare their letters of A, C, G, and T, you compare them to a modern Greek. And you see how different they are. And then you can also create a model. Okay, like, so let's compare it to a Slavic person, a Polish person. Okay, this is like an Ur-Slav, whatever, right? And it's, okay, how much of the ancestry of this Greek person would have to be Polish to explain the difference from the ancient Greeks? And it turns out to be like, it'll be like 17% or something.
Right.
So this person can be modeled to a high degree of statistical significance as an ancient Greek with some Polish ancestry.
I see.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's amazing because, I didn't appreciate this until reading your Substack posts, how much the sequencing of the human genome can inform history. Yeah. Right. Because there's certain, there's like for example, you have a very long post about Madagascar. Yeah. Where, the sequencing the genomes of I don't know what you
Malagasy.
Malagasy, which is what you call people from Madagascar, can give you accurate information about, the migrations to that island, right? Yeah. Which are not obvious and may not have been documented in this case. So like, what do we know about Madagasy from population genetics?
Yeah. So if you just look at them, you can tell they're Asian and African.
Right. Because they have like dark skin, probably darker than my skin in some cases, but their eyes and facial features look very similar to Southeast Asians or East Asians.
Exactly. So before genomics, people knew that there was a Southeast Asian connection. The reason is the Malagasy language is very close to Malay and Bahasa Indonesian. And this is something that, missionaries, Jesuits, I think it was Jesuits in particular, first noticed it because they went to Asia, and you would come back through Southern Africa and that region, and they would encounter, there's slaves from Madagascar in Cape Colony and stuff like that. And so they realized, okay, they're speaking a language that's not like Swahili, that's not like the Bantu languages of Southern Africa. It is a language like Malay or Bahasa Indonesian. So it was known 500 years ago by Europeans that there was this connection. But the details were hard to work out. Partly it's because, archaeology is not as well developed in this region of the world. In Europe, there's a lot of archaeology going on, partly because they've been investing in it for 2 centuries. And if you're government of Switzerland, you're going to invest in archaeology for Switzerland. So there's this bias that happens that way. So it has to be somebody else from the outside because it's a poor country. Okay. So let's set the archaeology aside, which there's some interesting thing related to that in terms of the forest getting burned down. It looks like Madagascar was not settled by humans until at the earliest, probably around 2,000 years ago, but really perhaps closer to 500 AD. So 1,500. And, we know this because there's all these endemic animals. So for example, the elephant bird, the heaviest,
which looks like a huge, bigger ostrich.
Yes. And it's like an ostrich on steroids.
Yeah.
Like they are very heavy, and they were very heavy. And they were around until like say 1200 AD, probably. The Arabs mentioned it. So probably the mythology of the roc, which is like a huge eagle, was inspired partly by the elephant bird. So this is in Sinbad, the Tales of Sinbad in the South Seas. So the Arabs and other populations or other, traders have started showing up in Madagascar around this time. But it looks like the people who really settled Madagascar is very specific. They are from the southeast region of Borneo. So when you look at the language, the language of Madagascar, it is closest to a particular obscure dialect of, I think, C Dayak, Austronesian language in Southeast Borneo. It's part of the Barito language family. Okay, so we know this from linguistics. What you can do with genetics is, okay, let's look at the genetics of the people of Madagascar, and let's see like which segments of their DNA match other populations in the world. Now, you could only do this very recently. We just didn't have, and maybe we could get into at some point, how far we've got in genomics in the last 20 years, because it's orders of magnitude.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is not like, they could have done this. Like, first of all, they couldn't have done this 10 years ago. Just too expensive, too difficult. So this is like a recent thing that I'm talking about. But in any case, so what you look at is you look at the segments of the genome. So if you're related to someone, there's a lot of matching segments. The more distantly related you are to someone, the fewer and fewer matching segments you have. So this is a way that you can get a very, very precise level of relatedness. So obviously you could just look at the Madagascar people, and you can look at some primitive genetic techniques and see, they're about half Asian, about half African. Like the precise number is actually like 40% East Asian, 60% African. There's a little bit 1 or 2% Arab and Indian, probably through traders and slaves or other things. Okay. So let's set that aside. The East Asian component, what they did is like they looked at the segments and they were like, okay, let's match it to all sorts of populations in the world. Okay, well, all of the best matches are happening in Southeast Asia. So let's drill down in Southeast Asia. And so they do the best matches and they sample, and they knew that linguistically the language is like the Borneo language, like the C Dayak language. So they have some samples from the C Dayaks, and it turns out that is the closest match in East Asia to the 40% of their genome that's Asian. So genetics has just confirmed what we kind of knew from linguistics. So we know that these people show up, all of these centuries ago, and they settle Madagascar. Now, the other part of their genome is African, is sub-Saharan African. So the Bantu expansion, and I'm working on a post on that, just for everyone out there, is relatively recent. So if it was a long time ago, genetically they shouldn't have been Bantu, but genetically they are Bantu. And so we know, and the Bantu show up in Mozambique, that area, probably around 500 AD, maybe a little bit earlier, but not too much earlier. And genetically, the African ancestry is Bantu, and there are some records, mostly by Arab traders, talking about it, of some of the kingdoms in Mozambique. They started, there were like invasions, and there was interaction with, what was going on in Madagascar. So it looks like the Austronesians, not Polynesians, Austronesians, because they're the Polynesians are the other branch. The Austronesians show up around 500 AD, and they start clearing the land. And it makes it aware to the people on the mainland who just showed up recently, the Bantu, who were setting up their kingdoms, that, oh, there's this island there. And so there's a lot of gene flow. Like some of it is probably slavery. But one thing that I mentioned in my piece is I'm not totally sure that it was mostly slavery, because one thing that happens when you have ancestry that comes through slavery is it comes through women usually. Because male slaves, I mean, look, they're just not very high status. I mean, they're not going to get. A lot of times, like the masters,
they're not going to leave offspring often.
Yeah. I mean, like we don't need to get into the sociological reasons, but you see this in the Arab world. The African ancestry is mostly maternal. In Madagascar, that's not true. There's actually more paternal African ancestry than maternal African ancestry.
And this is one of the most interesting things to me about population genetics is that because you have facts like the mitochondrial DNA, you only ever get it from
mothers,
your mother.
daughters.
So my mitochondrial DNA came from my mother and her mother and her mother and her mother exclusively. And then my Y chromosome comes, correct me if I'm wrong, pretty much unchanged from my father and unchanged from his father and unchanged from his father. Whereas all my other chromosomes, there's just mixing and matching.
They're mixing and recombining. And so, I mean, what I would say is like there is some mutation, and that's why we can create a tree. But it's very, very like low levels.
Very low levels.
And so basically, I think... try to do the math. I'd have to look this up. I think the probability is there's not going to be a mutational difference between you and your father, but it starts to be much more likely once you get grandfathers. Because I think there's 30.
But even if there were, it'd be so similar, right?
Yeah, it's very similar. And you need whole genome. So
I mean, but that makes it so that you're able to not just see, oh, there's African ancestry here. You can say it's coming mostly from women breeding with this other ethnic group, or it's coming mostly from men taking wives of a different ethnicity, et cetera.
So in Madagascar, the Y chromosome, like you're implying there, is informative of the fact that there's a lot of, I think it basically, there's a skew towards East Asian maternal ancestry and African paternal ancestry. Okay. And so, I mean, what does that mean? One thing is it's possibility that the original settlers were matrilineal. So they passed like their cultural identity through their mothers. And so these African men were integrated into those communities. This is actually, we see a little bit of this in among the Polynesians, where the Y chromosome is more Papuan, Melanesian in some of these communities, whereas the mitochondrial DNA tends to be disproportionately female. So, I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, so there needs to be more exploration of this. But it's not a simple case of like, oh, like they brought some slaves. To me, in my opinion, it's not going to be a simple case of they just brought some slaves for the mainland, because there's way too much male ancestry. And also their cultural practices. So they speak a language that's overwhelmingly Southeast Asian, but there are obviously loan words. Okay, we expect that. But so their religion is predominantly like pre-Islamic, before the world religions impacted Southeast Asia, they have an old type of Austronesian religion that has particular types of burial mounds, which you actually do see in places like Java and Borneo from like 2,000 years ago. Okay. But there are aspects of their religion and their magical systems that are clearly African. So there's aspects, and their music has a lot of African influence. So this isn't a situation where their culture was erased. So that to me, again, indicates that it's not simply just slavery. It's not an issue of subordination between two different populations. So for example, in the United States, African Americans, a lot of aspects of their culture are actually British. Obviously the religion, language, but, I'll give you a concrete example, like jumping over the broom. It's apparently Scottish, and it's because they came from all these different tribes, and their culture was famously erased. And it was a conscious choice that the masters made, right? They wanted to eliminate the cultural distinctiveness that made it so that they couldn't rebel as like a particular
tribe. A lot of African-American English grammar constructions, like you ain't doing that, like ain't, comes from apparently Scottish as well. It was a great Thomas Sowell essay. And a great a book called Albion Seed that I'm sure you're aware of.
Yes, I love it. Yeah, it's a great book. It's a great book. So, I mean, my point here is like, okay, so genetics is telling us that if we didn't have genetics, for example, I think, I'm going to be honest, I think what's going to happen is like Americans in particular would just be like, oh, well, we know how this works. They were slaves.
It was right.
That's what they'll say. But I'm just trying to say
genetics can complicate all of these narratives. And your posts have made me realize that any historian doing deep history history more than, say, 200 years ago needs to be dealing with population genetics to confirm and test theories of migration, conquest, intermixing, et cetera, because we can now get accurate information here. It's amazing. And another aspect of this I want to talk to you about is 23andMe and Ancestry.com. You know, a lot of people are using this now. I just did mine about 1 month ago.
All right. What'd you get?
So I'm about 55% Sub-Saharan African, 35% European, which with 2/3 of that being Iberian Peninsula and 1/3 of that being British Isles. And I'm 7% indigenous American. All right. So I've been joking that I'm blacker than Obama and more Native American than Elizabeth Warren.
Well, your mother is Puerto Rican?
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that's where I get, you know,
the indigenous
20% Iberian, Spanish, et cetera, from Spain, and then 7% indigenous. And one aspect of it that I found interesting was, and I don't know if this was confirmation bias on my part, but I was looking at the chromosomal pairings, 1, 2, 3, and it seemed like I could identify which chromosome came from which parent, because my dad has like no indigenous, and my mom, I think, had a lot of indigenous. So even though there was crossing over, there was one that had tended to have much more indigenous than another. So I could almost see that, and in my X chromosome, for whatever reason, maybe you know this, they don't give you information about your Y chromosome on 23andMe. But my X chromosome was almost entirely indigenous. Yes. That's your mother. Right. And that's your mother's mother. Right. Well, actually, not necessarily, because she has 2 X's. So, she has 2 X's that intermix, right? Yeah. So, but somehow it ended up that my X chromosome was like, even though I'm only 7% totally indigenous, my X chromosome is like 90% indigenous, according to 23. Yes. So just a couple of things. For the viewers out there, listeners, so Coleman is talking about like a chromogram. So there's, like 22, well, there's 23 with the X. So you have 22 pairs, and then you have the X, and he's seeing these bars with different colors. Yes, and that's what the ancestry is. That's right. And so that's a representation of the linear chromosome. The chromosomes are arranged in length. Chromosome 1 is the longest. Chromosome 22 is the shortest. And he has the X. The reason he doesn't have the Y is the Y isn't computable in terms of these ancestry functions, because, as we discussed earlier, the Y is passed intact from the father. Right. So why would that make it not? Because there's no admixture in the Y. It's not mixing. It's not recombining. Okay. Okay. But on the X, women have 2 pairs of X, and so there's recombination there. Men have 1 pair, so there's no recombination. Right. Okay. So there's going to be no recombination on the male, but 2/3 of the X's in a given generation are found in women. With a 50-50 population. Right. So there's still stuff going on there. So that's why you saw the X. Yeah. Now, in terms of these segments and what you're talking about, your intuition is correct. The technical term for this is ancestry deconvolution. And I'll give the listeners a simpler example, or the listeners and viewers a simple example. I have a friend who's a 4th Japanese. So her father is white. Her mother is half white, half Japanese. And so when you look at her chromogram, you actually, she is 24% Japanese. That's kind of what you'd expect. But you see like one segment that's 100% European, like it's like English, German, whatever. And then you see another segment that is it's mixed. It's 50-50. And it's alternated with East Asian and European ancestry. Every single one of those alternations, 100% for sure, because that it's a recombination event in her mother. Like you see exactly where in the chromosome it happened, because her mother has a Japanese mother and a European American father, right? And so this is like very, very interesting information. And this is one way that you can tell how long ago admixture happened. So I can look at, like, since you're half Puerto Rican, with a certain level of statistical power, geneticists can actually look at your segments and figure out when the indigenous and African mixed into, Iberian. That's right. Yeah. No, 23andMe actually, they do have a function like that. They do that way. Yes.
Yes.
ancestry is from 6 or 7
Yes.
generations ago, et
Yes.
cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, so what they're doing is they're looking at the length of the segments because every single generation there's recombination, the lengths break down. So when you look at Caribbean people, their admixture of indigenous ancestry, of Taino ancestry in Puerto Rico is like 300 years ago.
Yeah.
And so the segments are not very long at all. They're very, very small. And so what you see is a bunch of segments of a very particular length indicating that the pulse admixture happened over a 50-year period 350 years ago, things like that. When we look at the people in Madagascar, you can do a similar sort of thing. Statistical power starts to get a little wonky when you go beyond 2,000 years, just to be clear. But it's quite clear that the admixture happened mostly between 800 and 1200 AD in Madagascar between African people and East Asian people, because the initial generations had long segments, and those segments would shrink over time with every generation of recombination.
So what about these other characteristics that 23andMe try to, they give you these health assessments.
Yeah.
So for example, one thing I was very surprised by is they tell you whether you are likely to, your urine smells funny when you eat asparagus, right?
Yeah.
Everyone, either when you eat asparagus, either your pee smells weird or it doesn't. For me, it does. And I know that because it's impossible to ignore.
Okay, yeah.
And I like asparagus.
Okay.
But it actually got that wrong.
Oh, it did?
It got it wrong, and I was surprised because that seems like exactly the kind of trait that might be governed by just one gene.
Yeah, I think it is. So,
but if it were governed by just one gene, how could they possibly get that?
Well, there is a last I checked, there is a 0.4% miscall rate.
Okay. What is that?
That means that in 0.4% of the times that they make a call, it's false.
It has to be higher than that, though, because there were 3 or 4 things out of 30 that were wrong for me.
Okay,
but they were usually complex characteristics.
Yeah. So that's not a single thing. If it's a complex characteristic, the problem is, and I think most people who follow this are aware of this. You are a very genetically complex person with your ancestry.
Thank you, Razib.
So that makes it
I'm
little
complicated.
bit. That's a little bit more tricky. So let's assume you have a training set. So this is how you do it. You have a training set. You generate a model, and then you have test data. You put the test data into the training set. Well, if the training set is all European or all African American, okay, there's not going to be there's not a training set, to my knowledge, of people that are half African American, half Puerto Rican. Okay, with your ancestral mix. So the more primitive models, not necessarily primitive, but the earlier generation models, they tend to have problems with people of mixed heritage, in particular with complex traits, because the training sets are different. Some complex traits, some genes don't operate in the same way against an African genetic background that they would in a European genetic background, because there's enough genetic differences that gene interactions can have some effect.
Right.
I don't want to overemphasize this. This is I think the issue here is it's a big deal because you don't ever want to make a missed call on a disease.
Yeah.
But usually it's actually pretty accurate. The biggest difference is African to non-African because there's issues related to genetic diversity and genetic distance. But even there, it's mostly right. It's just that you can't have a 20-30% miscall rate and stuff like that. That's way too high. I'm overestimating. My only point here is when it comes to disease and trait prediction, it's going to be awkward if you're wrong. Yeah. And so that's why they really emphasize, we can't predict in another population as well and stuff like that. They have that in there.
So they try to predict even whether you have a fear of public speaking. So they have, and apparently 65% of people with my variant of this gene don't fear public speaking. Yeah. And it's true, I don't fear public speaking. But there's no way in hell that fear of public speaking is governed by one gene. That has to be
it's a complex trait.
Governed by thousands of genes and and experience to some degree, right?
So let's break it out. So the Mendelian traits, Mendelian single gene, monogenic things, that's what you're talking about. So cystic fibrosis. Everyone knows cystic fibrosis. You know what I'm saying. Cystic fibrosis is well known.
Is that governed by one gene?
It's mostly at one genetic position. Yeah. One genome. It's CFTR. I think that's what it is. Anyway, so cystic fibrosis, you can look in there. There's different mutations in there, so you can't just find one single mutant. You need to look for them. But in any case, cystic fibrosis is it's a breakdown in one genetic genetic location. There are other things like height, classical example, where there's, thousands of genetic positions in the genome that can be used as predictors. And that's because your height is the final end product of a lot of genetic effects distributed across the genome. And so what they'll do...
It's like, how tall is your shin bone and how tall is your thigh bone?
It's a complex developmental process. Right? So of course, right? And so what ends up happening is what you do is like you look across the genome and you create a predictor, polygenic index. Like they're changing the terms around to make it a little bit more PC. So just I think polygenic index is the last one I remember. So it's a polygenic index and it just shows you like what your predicted height would be based on your genome compared to all the other genomes out there in their training set. Training sets for height are pretty big. It gets and like height is about like 80 to 90% heritable in developed societies, which means that 80 to 90% of the variation in the population is due to genes. And so the predictive power is okay. It's pretty good. 80 to 90% heritable doesn't mean that that's like, for an individual, it's actually like a little lower because that's a population-wide statistic. I don't want people to like be like in the comments like, oh, he's confusing heritability with individual prediction. I'm not. But in any case, you can use these indices to make predictions, your risk to type 2 diabetes, all these other things. The way with type 2 diabetes, it's like an odds ratio. It's like, oh, you're like 10x more, likely than the average person to get it. So I don't know if they had a training set where someone did fear of speaking, but a lot of these just have to do with your personality. So like you take the big five.
My sense is like for 23andMe, it's self-report.
Yeah, that is self-report. They do have that.
Yeah.
But the issue is like because your personality is like an endophenotype that has a lot of upstream variables.
What do you mean by endophenotype?
It's like it's within you, and it's not like something you can measure with a caliper or like
So this is one thing I suspect. It's not really measuring people that don't fear public speaking. It's measuring
an output.
It's measuring people that would report on 23andMe that they don't fear public speaking.
Yeah, and you'll notice that there
could be a confound in some way, right?
Well, it's not a confound.
It could be overconfident people that are saying this.
Okay,
right?
Yeah. So what I would say there is picking up a downstream characteristic of your personality.
Yeah.
So like if you want it, because like psychology, they have these like models with schemas with like boxes. The upstream is like introversion, extroversion. That's really what it is. I'm 90% sure, and that's about like last I checked, like 30 to 50% heritable. Like the instruments for psychology are like kind of weird and not really great at tech. So I think the heritability is underestimated. It's much better with IQ because like, psychometric tests are much more precise than personality tests, But in any case, personality is also, I think most people know personality is also heritable, just not as heritable as height, right? And so the less heritable the trait is, the more of it is due to environment, which is not necessarily like the external environment. It's just various types of noise. And so that means that those predictors are going to be weaker and weaker. So, when you're looking at personality related things, that is, I would just say for entertainment value only.
Right.
Right now.
Right. So, do you think at all about gene editing? I know a few years ago, CRISPR and Cas9 were very much in the layman public conversation that you'll be able to go into an egg or a fertilized egg and delete this gene and make your kid a little prettier, a little taller, a little smarter, et cetera. What is the state of that technology and how do you think about that?
Yeah, I do think about that a lot. So this is like, I got to switch into a different mode now because so what I like to tell people, so I have a startup. It's called Generate. We do genomic data storage management and analysis. So it's in the data science, big data space. And what I like to tell people, my investors or potential investors when I'm pitching is a lot of my work, my academic work, work you might see publicly is about the past. Generate is about the future. And so you're talking about gene editing. That's the future. That's not the past, right? And so now we're talking about genetics in a different dimension. Instead of taking the tips of a phylogenetic tree and working backwards, we are now going to modify the tree somehow, right? So that's what you're talking about. And so people really interested in this, I would suggest go to the Generate podcast. I have an interview with a guy who works at a company that actually it's called CRISPR QC, Zach Rayborn. And what he does is I talked to him for an hour and 10 minutes. So if you want to get detailed on this, because he's the expert, basically, you need to figure out which genes you need to edit, which positions to get the most fidelity. You don't want to do experiments on human beings. So a lot of the CRISPR work that's done on animals or plants, whatever. Like, no offense to the animal rights people out there, but with humans, you don't want to mess people up. So with gene editing, there's a bunch of technologies. Recombinant DNA technology is the oldest one that goes back to the 1970s. So it's very expensive and very difficult. There was I think it was 1999. There was a horrible experiment gone wrong where a kid died, and he was a teenager, and really gene editing didn't need to be done, and he died. And so there's been like a pall that was cast over gene editing for really the past generation. The trial regime is much more stringent and stuff like that. Okay, so why is CRISPR-Cas9 a big deal? And it's not just CRISPR-Cas9. Like one thing I've recently learned or been made aware of is there's a bunch of different Cases. So it's just, let's just say CRISPR-Cas, okay? The reason it's a big deal is because it's cheap and it's easy. So it brings gene editing to the people, right? So the idea of gene editing abstractly, like you go in, you take a base pair region of the genome, you excise it, you put something else in. Okay, that's easy to understand. How do you do it in an engineering sense? Well, it turned out bacteria, they have ways to do it because, they have billions of years of evolution. And this was a bacterial system that was actually known in the 1980s and 90s, but they never thought to apply it. And that was like the quote genius. It was this like, stumbling upon this that Doudna and Charpentier did, they got the Nobel for it and everything like that, right? Okay. So how do I think about it and how important is it? Well, I wrote an article for a magazine called Return. I think I wrote it in like end of 2020, and I talked about, they're going to like cure cystic fibrosis, sickle cell, and all these things, like the really bad Mendelian diseases that you hear about, and Jerry's kids, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And in the last 3 years, and that piece was actually only published on the internet like a month ago, and someone, some guy was saying, well, this is like, puffery, like, is any of this happening? And I just like, I posted a link to a girl who had been cured of sickle cell in 2021. So they're working on sickle cell.
With gene editing.
Yes, with gene editing.
Wow.
They're already starting to work on sickle cell. There are already people walking around that were cured as adults. They're working on cystic fibrosis.
Cured as adults.
Yes.
So how does that work? I mean, if every cell in your body already has a copy of your full genome, how do you go in and edit? Yeah.
So what you do is, so this is the big issue. Gene editing is a big issue for at least the, developed organisms is how do you deliver the edit? And so they use like vectors like viruses. That's very common. So viruses will infect your cell, and they're the payload that transfers the CRISPR-Cas9, right? Let's say lungs. I'm going to use cystic fibrosis as an example. The life expectancy is like 40 to 50 now, I think, with good treatment. And the issue here is not the issue, the dream, which I think will happen within the next 10 years, really the next 5, is that you will have a payload that will get in there and restore maybe like 10 to 20% of lung function. You're going to be like basically be able to survive and do everything except for like strenuous sports then.
Wow.
So with a lot of these issues, you just need to rescue some minimal level of function so they can live most of their life out,
Right.
You don't need to go up to like the level of like, I'm going to be like doing like high intensity, exercise. Right. So that's what I'm thinking for that. With ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, where it's like it's a muscle, muscular dystrophy and stuff like that. Obviously, when they fix it by like transfecting somehow the muscle tissue, delivering it to the muscle tissue, they're going to have some issues. They're not going to be very strong, but they're not going to like die of like heart collapse, or like asphyxiation because the muscles do not work anymore, right? That's the dream. And so I think that's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. But, there's going to be like pretty, non-trivial changes. I don't want to say like radical, but non-trivial changes in like genetically editing, So in agriculture, these big companies like Bayer Monsanto, I think Monsanto was bought by Bayer, I think. But anyway, one of them. They've been able to do this stuff for decades because it was extremely expensive and only they had the economies of scale. And also the regulatory regime is really strict. The thing with CRISPR technology, from what I've been told by my friends in plant genetics, is it's extremely easy. You can have like a small lab and start doing experiments. And so right now, the regulatory overhead is really putting a clamp down on that. But, not every country is going to regulate as much as the U.S. So I think we're going to see like a lot of different, a second green revolution possibly. That's what I hope for. There's things with animals as well that they're working on with fertility and other things. So I think we're going to see that visibly first when it comes to traits besides disease. Okay. Right now we're going to focus on diseases that adults have, try to fix all of the, and like, I think like 5% of Americans have some sort of congenital disease. They're not all horrible, but that's millions and millions of people.
Yeah.
You know, and so if it's cheap, and like right now there's issues with price and stuff like that. If it's cheap, I think most people will do it. And then, you know, I mean, I hope the drug industry is investing in this because they might lose some, you know, there might be some revenue issue with like people not needing to take drugs for the next like 30 or 40 years of their lives. Right. Right. So they should like know to invest in this sort of stuff. Probably
those pharma companies will lobby Congress to make this illegal and scare people about gene editing being too sci-fi. That's my prediction.
I mean, because
it'd be a very easy thing to scare people about because editing your genome, there's something very invasive and very, I mean, for everything you want to say about why humans get scared of vaccines, the needle going in the arm and the concept of getting a small dead version of a disease, all these things trigger kind of an irrational fear in people. Yeah. I mean, all of that is 10x, I think, for changing your genome.
I agree. Right. I agree. Like one thing I've said before and I've said over the years is genes are not magic. Mm-hmm. They're just a real thing. We understand them really well now all of a sudden, you know, because of genomics. But that doesn't matter. Like psychologically, people do think they're kind of magical. Yeah. You know?
So I want to pivot a little bit. You have all these interesting posts about how the genome relates to ethnicity and mixtures of people and migrations and conquests and all of this stuff. And this is relevant to the question that has been, you know, debated ad nauseum in papers and books and popular culture and so forth. Is race a social construct or a biological reality? And by race, I mean the sort of typical 5 or 6 categories that people tend to think about that we would check on a, you know, government census form: white, black, Asian, Hispanic, etc. So do you conceive of these categories as biological realities or as a social construct?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of race, you know, we're both American. In America, it's, you know, a particular thing which is different than in other countries. So obviously there's a social construct aspect to it, but, you know, we look a particular way. And if someone was like, you know, 2 Swedish men talking, they'd be like, okay, like when did their ancestors come to Sweden? I mean, they would immediately know that like we are not descendants of, at least mostly, Vikings. Like you might have a little bit of Viking in you, actually.
Maybe from British
African American. Yeah. And like, you know, there's Northern England, the Danelaw. But the point is, you know, when you say it's a social construct, people know what that means. So I'll give you a concrete example. The word Caucasian is still used in the United States for white people. It's not used for white people in Europe. This is just like a weird thing. I mean, a Caucasian comes from Caucasoid. It's actually not a PC thing, but somehow it became PC-ified. Okay. I have a friend, she was Finnish, and they got a genetic test that they were going to do for some like experiment. And it was from an American vendor. And it said like, you know, that you should, the predictiveness of this test is only viable for Caucasians. Issue in Finland though is they were thinking, wait, why would you design a test for people from Georgia, Armenia, or Azerbaijan?
The Caucasus.
Yeah. So in Europe, like, and if you go to Russia and you say someone's Caucasian, that's like saying they're, you know, like Mexican. You know, like Caucasians have like their reputation as like, you know, these dark criminal people from the Caucasus that cause problems, right? Obviously in the United States it's totally different. So, okay, yes, it is a social construct in some ways. I think that's like trivially obvious. You know, there are people, like I'll give you another concrete example. The whole like Latino thing, which was like Asian American, was just created in the 1960s and 70s by American like governmental bureaucrats, you know. You know, I've talked to like Latino people who are white. They have blue eyes, and like they want to do brown solidarity with me, and I'm just like I'm brown. You're not okay. Like, can we just like cut this out? You know, like obviously, like I get what you're doing. Yes, you have like a Spanish surname, so I guess technically you're an underrepresented minority while I'm white adjacent in the United States, but, you know, which is like literally true for a lot of things, you know? But I mean, we know what's going on, and this is like a social political ideology thing. It has nothing to do with your ancestry, which is mostly from the Iberian Peninsula. Like you're a white person. Like when you walk down the street,
Mhm.
They don't point at you and be like, yo, you're a brown guy. No, you're,
Mhm.
when they point at me, they're like, okay, yeah,
Mhm.
So I think like, okay, yes, it is obviously social. But what I write about a lot and what I focus on is, like population structure, population history. A lot of times people get caught up in the semantics and, I mean, you've had Charles Murray on,
Yeah.
and, Chuck is, he like abandoned the word race because it's just got too much baggage and it confuses people. So you just use population structure, genetic ancestry, and things like this, right? So I do have a question that people often come back with me to me. Often they're like well-educated professionals, like lawyers. Like this is usually lawyers actually, and they were told that race is a social construct, it has no biological reality, and then they do a test like you did, and then they're just really confused because they're like, wait a second,
How does it know?
how does it know? How does it know if it's just a social construct?
Like 23andMe trace my ancestry to a specific town in Puerto Rico, a specific area of Puerto Rico where I happen to know through family lore is where my grandparents were from.
Yes. And so how it knows is because, if you think about your ancestry, there's this genealogy that goes back into time, hundreds of thousands of years, and your genetics is a reflection of that genealogy. So my ancestors, within the last 300 years, all seem to have lived in the Bengal province of the northeastern part of the Indian subcontinent, right? And so they intermarried with each other. And so there's a particular genetic signature associated with that region of the world because of the people that live there. And then if you go back like 10,000 years, my ancestors actually lived in the Middle East, in Central Asia, parts of Europe, in the Indian subcontinent, so it's like you're the outcome of all of these historical events of mixing between populations, but each of those populations themselves are separable into individual units, and these individuals, they have their own stories and their own histories. It depends on population to population. So some populations are what we call panmictic, which means that yes, they are varied within each other, but they've been mating as an endogamous unit for, hundreds, thousands of years. And so they have a very, very specific signature of very, very specific mutations that emerged in that population over that time.
You gave the example of Ashkenazi
Yes, they're the classic
Jews.
one.
Yeah,
the classic one. So the Ashkenazi Jews, and I have like several posts on this. Ashkenazi Jews are the product of the fusion of a Western European-like population, a Middle Eastern population, a Central European population, and they all basically the fusion happened by about like 1200 or so, maybe a little earlier. And then at some point in the medieval period, they stopped taking new genes in. They stopped taking like no more applicants to the club, And so for 500, 600, 700, 800 years, that's how it went. And now obviously in the United States and in Europe, the social barriers are different. And so now Ashkenazi Jews, a lot of them, are intermarrying. I have a lot, we all have friends that are part Jewish, quote unquote.
Right.
But, in 1500, basically everybody that was raised with the Jewish religion had Jewish parents. Now, there were people who were Christian who had been raised with the Jewish religion. But those people would intermarry with other Christians and kind of like the genetic signal there would disappear, aside from the conversos, which are a special case where they, crypto Jews that maintain their identity. But in any case.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I look at this question is I think of race as a social construct that's inspired by biological reality.
Sure.
As opposed to something like biological sex, which just is a reality in my view, right?
Yeah.
Biological sex clusters almost perfectly. If you can separate people into XX and XY,
it's dichotomous,
and correlate them with their genital type, and you will get 99% plus two groups, right?
Yes.
If you try to do that with genomes, and there I know that you're aware that there are studies like this, you say how many clusters should we separate the human species into just based on the natural principles of statistical clustering? You can cluster people into the 5 or 6 races, but the clusters are much weaker, right? Yeah. They're like I don't, the paper that I looked at, it's like 0.8 or something.
Yeah.
And that means that there are clusters, but they bleed into each other very substantially, so that you have probably, hundreds of millions of people that are more genetically similar to people in a different cluster than their own. And the boundaries are very blurry here.
Yeah.
And the way that I think about it is it's a bit like the concept of race is to biological reality what the concept of a month is to the lunar cycle, right? It's like clearly the fact our months are like 30 days or 31 days. That's because they're inspired by the lunar cycle, which is precisely, whatever it is, 29.5 on average. But that social construct of a calendar month has just flown the perch of the thing that inspired it. So that if we were to discover tomorrow that the lunar cycle is actually like 35 days, we're not going to change our calendar months, right?
Sure.
And race is very much like that. It's like whatever you discover about the Malagasy on Madagascar, we're not going to change the box that they check or anything like that, because the social construct has flown the perch of the thing that inspired it.
Yeah. So let's back up on the science. What you're talking about the 0.8. So I think what you're talking about is fixation index, FST. And so the stylized facts, which is pretty much true, is that, 0.1, basically 15% of the variation between continental races. Mm-hmm. When you take let's really concretely, when you take a bunch of people from Nigeria and a bunch of people from Sweden, mm-hmm. let's say 100, and then you pool them together and you have 3 billion base pairs in the genome. You have about 4 to 6 million variations per genome. Okay, so these variations are the variables in your statistic that you're generating. How much of those variations are found within the populations versus between the populations. Mm-hmm. So there's a subset of the variations that make Swedes distinct from Nigerians. Mm-hmm. You know this because they look very different, mm-hmm. okay? But then there's a bunch of other variations that overlap between the two, and that's mm-hmm. what you're talking about, mm-hmm. right? So about 80 to 90% of the genetic variation overlaps, where, mm-hmm. There's an adenine A in a Swede, or it could be a guanine G, mm-hmm. and then there's a bunch of Nigerians. So it's the guanine is 57% Swedes, and maybe it's 52% Nigerians. Mm-hmm, okay? Mm-hmm. So just to give the viewers a concrete example. So there's a little bit of variation, but really it's just within the population. You can't differentiate. There's other cases, so for example, concrete, SLC24A5 is, it's a solute carrier, it's a cell membrane. But anyway, the TLDR is, in Europeans, it's 100% in the A variant, and in Africans, it's about 95 to 98% in the G variant. Mm-hmm. So when you're saying there's overlap, there's a little bit, but mm-hmm. mostly that actually differentiates the two populations. Right. So those are the type of genes, they're usually not that extreme. Those are the type of genetic positions that differentiate populations, right? Mm-hmm. And so obviously, this is not like sex, where it's kind of a clear and distinct category. Mm-hmm. This is an aggregate, and you're looking at a statistic. So I can tell you with really, really, really high confidence mm-hmm. That someone is an ethnic Swede mm-hmm. or an ethnic Igbo, just mm-hmm. like 23andMe did, mm-hmm. that you saw. Because when you look over millions and millions of variant, you're aggregating all of that information. Mm-hmm. And so you can actually say with a high precision what ethnic identity someone is, mm-hmm. but it's pulling out of this vast pool, and how you cut and align the pool in terms of categories is somewhat arbitrary. It's not arbitrary insofar as so for example, if you do a naive phylogenetic tree, it's going to separate out Africans first. Mm-hmm. It's going to separate Khoisan, Southern Africans first. Mm-hmm. And then there's going to be a second tree, and that tree will separate other Africans and non-Africans. Mm-hmm. And then the non-African tree will separate out East Eurasians, or actually it'll separate out West Eurasians, Middle Eastern Europeans, mm-hmm. and then it'll separate out everybody else, which mm-hmm. is people in Australia, China, the New World, and then South Asians will be kind of in the middle. Anyway, mm-hmm. There's going to be a natural flow to that. Mm-hmm. But then how many clusters do you define? So for example, Asian American was created, I think in 1970 census. Mm-hmm. Or maybe the 80 census, because I think Asian Indians were separated out initially. It was the 80 census. The Asian Indians wanted to be aggregated to Asian Americans because there's affirmative action contracts that they wanted. Okay, mm-hmm. that's really the truth. Mm-hmm. But I've seen medical genetics papers where they've talked about the fact that Asian people of Indian subcontinental heritage are genetically closer to Europeans than they are to East Asians. Mm-hmm. They're kind of in the middle, but they're closer to on average. Okay, so
wait, sorry, say that again.
People of Indian subcontinental heritage are closer to Europeans than they are to East Asians.
Okay.
Genetically.
And does that have anything to do with the Aryan
It does somewhat,
connection
yes.
between.
Yeah.
You know,
So I don't know if you want to get into
the
this.
Indian swastika that was like slightly turned as opposed to the Nazi swastika.
Okay,
right?
so I know we've been like getting like pretty dirty. I wanted to like. Really
I know you have a long post on this as well, right?
Yeah. I've written about like So there was a guy who like an Indian guy in Germany, Indian German, who claimed that there was a hate crime against him, and so there was a swastika on his car, and people pointed out that. That's not a Nazi swastika. That's an Indian swastika.
So another Indian put.
No, he did it.
He did it.
Later, they found out that he did it, but it was because like, he didn't do the research. Like he did the Indian because the cops immediately looked at it and they're like, "We're German. We know what
is not a German swastika."
Anyway, so that was funny. So yeah, a lot of populations actually. So Indians are one, Europeans are another. Did not really exist more than 5,000 years ago. So that's why when I talk about the tree, it's not really a tree. It's like a lattice with like multiple nodes that are verging and coming together. Yeah. So like people that look like me, like I mean maybe like there was some people 4,000 BC, but not really before 4,000. You know what I'm saying? So I have like my ancestry. Like I'll give you like a quick breakdown just so the viewers know. So I'm Bengali. I'm about like 15% East Asian, like Burmese, which is not common in the Indian subcontinent. But if you look at where I'm from, it makes sense. Like my family's from the really, really far northeast. And then the rest of the 85%, I'm about like 10 to 15% Indo-Aryan, like steppe, like straight out of like Poland. From 2,500 BC. Okay. Wow. And then the rest of my background is like 50-50 mixed of like something ancient in the Indian subcontinent that's related to Andaman Islanders and, it's closer to East Asians and the other part is more like Iranians.
I see. So interesting. With these tests, how do they choose when to draw the line? Because we're all from like roughly East Africa. If you go back far enough. And then people migrated around 50,000 years ago, the major out of Africa migrations and so forth. But people have just been migrating the whole time. So like at what point do you say you're this because your ancestors at this time were here as opposed to there?
This is an easy answer because I've been in the rooms like, so just so people know, like, so like I do the Substack thing and I've done writing, but I've been working in this space actually for a decade. So I work for Family Tree DNA. I work for the co-founder of 23andMe, Linda Avey. She left in 2010. So I worked and I've done like development for National Geographic for their tests and stuff like that. So I have a background in this. A lot of this, like, there's market research that comes in. So people want certain things. And they don't want
people want it a certain far back, but not further.
Yeah, because they don't understand. Like if I told someone that they were like, 15% Western European hunter-gatherer, like 35% early European farmer and 15% corded ware or 50% corded ware, there's going to be a certain subset of people that are going to be into that, like hyper nerds. But most people are like, what does that mean? Yeah. So for example, 23andMe, they had a decision that was made early on. I think I can talk about this because this is so long ago now. They really decided to use nationality, like nation-state names. Yeah. Because people understand that. Yeah. That causes some problems. So, every population geneticist who's looked at this will confirm this. There's really no German genetic cluster. Okay. What does that mean? That means that people in Eastern Germany are more like Poles. People in Northern Germany are more like Danes. People in Western Germany are more like Northern French. So Germany was just made out of a multi-ethnic empire. Yeah, it's in the middle of Europe, Europa. And so that's what it was. And a lot of people in the East, for example, were Germanized during the drive to the East in the medieval period. This is all like understandable by the history, but it's just a pain in the butt because a lot of Americans are German American. They want to know that. Yeah. But like, how do you define, and there are statistical techniques you can do, but it's kind of like you have to like, want a certain outcome. So you want to tell someone that they're German American. Okay, so you take these like 4 or 5 clusters, you find the particular unique signatures to them, and you label them all German. And you make sure that you don't confuse someone who's Pole or French for one of there are things you have to do, but this is not naturally coming out of the data. What naturally comes out of the data is that there's like there's a Polish, there's a Ukrainian, there's a et cetera. Yeah, but the Germans are not. Sorry. Germans are not a natural genetic cluster. Interesting. And that's been a major... French, to a lesser extent, have the same problem. The British, they don't have as much of a problem. You know why? They're an island. Exactly. Right. So that's natural. Right. Islands, a lot of this is just about natural barriers. Yes. Like nature creates barriers, and so people procreate with availability. The availability with a limited set of people for a very long time. Yeah. And that's how you get these clusters popping out. Exactly.
You were about to though explain the Indian Aryan connection.
Well, I'm gonna get like Indians mad at me. They always Indians really care about this sort of stuff, which like they're the ones who really care about this really deep ancient history just because of colonialism. So basically, so I'll tell you guys my Y chromosome. The earliest place. This is like a pretty weird fact. The earliest place that it's been found in ancient DNA is basically around the Pripyat marshes, border of like Poland and Belarusia. Okay. And so just like the sequence is quick, like ignore you can look up the names, but they're not relevant. So basically what happened is around like 2500 BC, there was a group of Indo-Europeans called the corded ware culture, a little earlier actually. Some of them decided to go west, and they become like ancestors of like Slavs and other people, basically Central Europeans. Some of them decide to go east. Which is like, if you're going to draw the straw, that's the short straw. Like going eastward into Eurasia when you're an agro-pastoralist is not good. But anyways, they became something called the Fatianovo-Balanovo culture. They basically like expanded like right between the steppe and the taiga, like in that like little zone where there was like agriculture was feasible in central Russia. They kept going eastward and they hit the Ural Mountains. In the Ural Mountains, they decided that they wanted to start killing each other. So they start creating these towns, these fortified towns, and you see evidence of these burials of people that are killed in massacres. And they just decided to go full war on each other. They invented something called the light war chariot around 1900 BC. That spread all across Eurasia really quickly. And it looks like they were the mediators, these people. They're called the Santashta people. They were the mediators of the light war chariot. So in northern Syria, we have records of a population called the Mitanni, where their chariot class were called the Marianu, which is the Sanskrit word for young warrior. So it looks like these Indo-Iranian people started spreading out of the southern Urals about 1800 BC, right? So the Indo-Iranian languages, they're spoken in the North Caucasus now, but they used to be spoken all across Central Asia with the Scythians and the Sarmatians, all those groups. They got overwhelmed by the Turks. In Iran, obviously they speak Farsi, Iranian, all those languages, those Iranian languages. Indian subcontinent, 3/4 of people speak Indo-Aryan languages, which, the closest languages in the Indo-European language family to them are Baltic and Slavic. Okay. And so what started happening, so there was always this idea of the Aryans because of the languages. And, like some people in India, they look kind of white. Just so people are like, okay, like why do they, so what's up with that?
You mean aside from their skin color? What do you mean?
Just if you look at their face, yeah,
their facial features look closer to Europeans, you're saying?
This is like really weird, but there's a group that called Jats from Punjab. Like Nikki Haley's a Jat. And like if you look at some Jats, they don't look Middle Eastern white. They look Eastern European white. Which is actually what the genetics has ended up confirming. They have the highest proportion of steppe ancestry in the Indian subcontinent, about like 30% or so. So about 30% of their ancestry is like straight out of Belarus. That's the way you could think about it. At least 4,000 years ago. And so, there was always these suspicions, but what the genomics came back with was like, and I started doing the analyses when the data started coming back, and I was like, okay, there's a minority of the Indian ancestry, especially people in the Northwest and the upper castes, that looks more like Europeans, and particularly like Eastern Europeans, which is weird. Okay, so if you're going to think that people in the Indian subcontinent have like Western ancestry, well, like Iran, West Asia. Yeah. That's closer.
Right.
But so what happened was there was like a mass migration of these chariot guys all over Eurasia. And my Y chromosome, like you can find it in Mongolia, you can find it all across Central Europe. You can find it in Sri Lanka. Like it's all over the place. Okay. So these guys went everywhere. So that's like the minority component. So depending on like what part of I did like an estimate that like overall, the whole of like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, about 15% of the ancestry is from these Indo-Aryans. But they're critical because they brought the language Sanskrit, which is the ancestry of the Indo-Aryan languages. But it also affected like the Dravidian languages in the south of the subcontinent. And then like a lot of the skeletal structure of Hinduism comes from these people. So if I need to like learn something about early Indo-Europeans, you go to the Hindu holy texts because they actually like preserve that stuff. A lot of the stuff in the Hindu holy texts, like you can find it in fragmentary in fragments in Greek and Roman stuff, but they, after Christianity and other things, like their oral, like traditional culture was really, really kind of fell away. Whereas modern Hindus, like they preserved a lot of that old stuff. So Brahmins are like, their mantras like have elements that I think clearly come from the steppe. you know? And also, like, when you read, I'll stop here because this is weird, but this to me is like, we'll show you guys what's going on. So, you know, it's famously, they're the Ashvin twins. They're these twins, these gods that show up in Indian mythology. They're basically the equivalent of Gemini twins in Greeks. And like, there's also twins in the Germanic mythology. Okay, so this is an ancient Indo-European primal thing. So I knew that when I was reading the Mahabharata for the first time. There's a part of the Mahabharata, though, that jumped out at me because I've read the Iliad relatively recently, where someone has sex during the day. And that was like really immoral. There's a part of the Iliad where Helen and Paris have sex during the day. And that's like stated as very immoral. So I think like these sorts of weird things are fragments of like steppe taboos that are preserved, and they have no meaning to us now. But you know, if you're living in like wagons, I don't know, maybe you don't want to have sex during the day because the wagon's, you know, rocking and like it's awkward. I don't know. You know what I'm trying to say? I'm just trying to give up. But I mean, like I read that in both those, you know, and like these are like two totally different cultures, probably separated 4,000 years ago, but it's still there, you know?
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, you should write a book. I mean, are you writing a book about this?
I can't.
Because,
I don't have the bandwidth. Like, I have a startup. It's called Generate. Everyone out there, if you want to look it up. So if the startup fails,
it's just amazing to me how many aspects of what we thought might be true about deep history can be tested, confirmed, or refuted with population genetics.
Yes, exactly. 100%.
I don't think that your average history PhD right now has a population genetics course, but they probably should.
Yeah. Yeah, right? if you're talking about demographics, because what this is demographics. Yeah. And so when people say things like, you know, and like I have talked to historians, and sometimes I'll just be like, no, you're wrong. And then they get pissed because they're just like, well, I have a history PhD. And I'm just like,
exactly. And
well,
I've been
really
looking at archives and, well, the human genome is the ultimate archive. It
is. And this doesn't go to like all the cultural stuff.
That's right.
There's a lot of stuff going on
which can't be tested this way.
But I'll give you an example. Like, you know, archaeologists are frankly, they're really butthurt.
So now you pissed off Indians, archaeologists.
Okay, but you know my oeuvre. Like, I don't care. So the thing with archaeologists, they've spent their careers like assembling these pots and being like, well, the pots changed there, and like this pot style obviously evolved from that pot style and stuff like that. Okay, so one of the most shocking things that happened in the last 10 years is so, you know, Indo-European languages are spoken in India, Iran, and obviously Europe. And, you know, there was a hypothesis that, oh, well, maybe they spread from Central Asia or maybe they're indigenous, whatever, you know, we're going to get into the details. But what happened is, you know, several different labs, mostly Eske Willerslev and David Reich's like groups, but whatever, there's other groups out there. About like 2015, they like started digging up samples from Northern Europe. Well, it turns out that it wasn't like elite cultural diffusion. They just like killed everybody. You know, like it was bad. I mean, it's shocking. Like you wouldn't have believed it if they told you without the genetic evidence. Okay. So, you know, there was like more than 50% replacement pretty much everywhere in Northern Europe. But in some places, like, so for example, in Sweden, there's a group of farmers called the Funnelbeaker culture. They created these great megaliths. So there's a megalith culture. Stonehenge is the most famous, but there's plenty of others. The megalith culture people were originally from, you know, the Mediterranean, really Anatolia originally. They brought farming to Europe. Those people were like really, really decimated by the arrival of Indo-Europeans between 2300 BC and 2900 BC, depending on where they came in from the east. So, but in Sweden, they totally exterminated the Funnelbeaker people. There's no genetic imprint of the Funnelbeaker people. In Britain, the Stonehenge people, about like 10% of the genome is from them. So they mostly overwhelmed them, you know? There are other areas like Southern Europe, it's like 30 to 40%. So mostly they're still mostly like the original farmer ancestry. So this like really shocked people. And this is a big deal because there were some anthropologists and archaeologists that had created these models of like, okay, well this corded, so specifically there's something called corded ware pottery that's associated with the arrival of we now know it's a culture from the steppe. They're basically from Ukraine. They're the Yamnaya people. They ran around with maces and they smashed people's heads. Okay, like that's just like stylized fact, but it's true. But like there's these archaeologists that developed this theory that, well, actually they came from the baskets of the previous people, and so they just kind of evolved culturally into this new culture. No, they just were killed. Okay, we know that now. But like these archaeologists have been doing this for 30 or 40 years, so all their papers are wrong. So they're kind of pissed. Yeah. Because they're just like, look, we put a lot of work into this. And I'm like, yeah, but you're wrong. You know, I mean, I don't say that.
We brushed a lot of dust off of
pottery. And I'm not trying to hate. So actually, there is an explanation for the corded ware. So the word lady is not an Indo-European word. It looks like about 25% of the ancestry of the corded ware is from a culture called globular amphora, which is the last Neolithic culture in Poland. And it looks like it was that there was what we call male-mediated migration. That's just a way of saying that, like, you know, the women were taken. And so these women brought some of their cultural traditions. So a lot of the words for certain farming things in Northern Europe are not Indo-European because they didn't farm. They were pure pastoralists when they first arrived. And also the corded ware baskets, those patterns, or not baskets, the pottery, they probably were local women who did the pottery. But the men who showed up from the steppe, they're used to baskets. So the cords, that imprint, it's mimicking baskets. So it's a cultural synthesis. The pottery is from the native people, yes, from the women that they took. But the unique, like, corded pattern is probably a reflection of the fact that these guys, they grew up with everything in baskets.
Right.
So now we know.
So another interesting post you had along these lines was the deep roots of the Han Chinese.
Oh, yeah.
What has population genetics revealed about I think it's still the largest country in the world. Maybe India may have overtaken it.
Just recently, but the Han are the largest ethnicity in the world.
The largest ethnicity in the world. Yeah. And your post revealed to me the most continuous, in the sense that Han Chinese people today have the most in common with the unearthed bones of Han Chinese from thousands of years ago. Yeah. So what I'm getting at here is, like, so David Reich's book, Who We Are and How We Got There, has a bunch of stuff on this. Date 2018. It's still pretty accurate. There's still some changes now. But in any case, so you have Europe, and so, like, let's say, like, we have like three, let's say 4 herds of the Eurasian, like, white cumin, like the civilized, you know, whatever, like 2,000 years ago. You have Europe, Mediterranean, you have West Asia, the Middle East, you have India, and you have China. And then everything else kind of comes, like, Southeast Asia is kind of a combination of India and China in a lot of ways culturally. Okay. So when you look at India and Europe, the ancient DNA is quite clear. There was a massive, like, cataclysm about, like, 4,000 years ago, and there was admixtures and changes. So people in Europe 10,000 years ago looked nothing like people in Europe today. Like, they had very dark skin, they had blue eyes, dark hair, very, like, robust, coarse features. Okay, like, they were totally dark skin but blue eyes.
Yes, totally different people. They're what called Western hunter-gatherers. Google it. Those are the indigenous people that were there at the end of the Ice Age. Okay. And so in the Indian subcontinent, there's probably no West Eurasian ancestry. Like, so half of the ancestry of the Indian subcontinent today was not there. They're dark-skinned people. They looked more like Africans, although, like, if you look at Andaman Islanders, like, they have, like, Africans, curly hair. But, like, if you look at their faces, you can tell they're not African. Like, I mean, it's just, like, not all very dark-skinned people look the same, believe it or not. So you can kind of, I've seen Andaman Islanders where I'm like, oh, that kind of looks Indian. Like, you can see, like, Indian features that came from those type of people, right? So anyway, so you have those type of people there. Obviously, Europe and India's changed in radical ways. Europe more than India, but both of them changed radically. You would not recognize the people. In West Asia, it's a little different. West Asia had, like, a lot of genetic differences at the beginning of this period with agriculture, but they kind of, like, mixed and mushed into, like, one, like, whole. That's the way I'll say it. So West Asia changed in terms of, like, people from Iran were totally different than people from Syria. The genetic distance is actually the same as modern Chinese versus Northern Europeans back then. Wow. And those people mixed together, though. So they created just this amalgamated whole. Okay, so that's the change there. China is the weird one, or not weird, but it's the exception in terms of, like, the Neolithic people in northern China exhibit rough continuity of people in modern day Shaanxi and Hainan and, like, those areas in the Yellow River. There's some stuff going on in the south that's different, but there was some gene flow back and forth. There was some mixture. There was expansion out of the north. I mean, you know it from the post, but basically, it wasn't totally different. Like, it was like, okay, I can believe this. Because the stuff from Europe and India, if you talked to me 15 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it. It just doesn't comport with what we know in anthropology and other things. Like, how would, like, these people move? Like, why would they be so brutal? Are people that evil? Are people that mean? Yeah, they are. That's what we know now. But in China, it's like, okay, there was some migration here and there, but basically the base is what you would think it is. So the people that live in China today are descended from these Ice Age foragers that were, like, wandering the Yellow River Basin 11,700 years ago. That's not true in India. That's not true in Europe. There's new people that came. In West Asia, there's been like a lot of mixing in a way where it's hard to recognize that they are the same people, even though the basic elements are there. In China, it is a predominantly Yellow River Basin expansion. I think the Erlitou culture.
Though that is remarkable, in some way it would match with how the history of China is generally talked about as pretty much the oldest continuous civilization that has one people with a self-concept.
I think it's true.
And, thousands of years of dynasties that have seen themselves as one nation, right? So in some ways it confirms China's self-image,
the Chinese say 5,000 years of history. And that's kind of like wrong, because the really first date you have is, I think, like the defeat of the Shang by the Zhao. And I think that's like 1076 or 1100. We know this because they're into astrology. There's particular alignment of the stars and the moon and all these things.
Yeah.
They record it. And so we can actually use like astronomical techniques now to get the specific date.
Yeah.
So we have that date around like 3,100 years ago. And so that's when the history. We know that the Shang dynasty from the oracle bones, we know that they were the Shang dynasty. So we have writing. We don't know about the previous dynasties. I think Xia, but that's probably the Erlitou culture. But basically, I think 5,000 years, I think that's, I hate this phrase, but it's that's not really wrong. I mean, it is kind of right.
Yeah.
And the continuity is true. Like Indians sometimes like to say, oh, we have continuity, but I'm like, yeah, but like Indians are a synthesis of different things. So yes, Indians do have continuity. Like if you want to know what the original Indo-Europeans were like, you go to the Vedas, because they've actually like maintained that. But genetically and culturally, look, I mean, like Indian gods are obviously, even the earliest Vedas show like subcontinental influence. So like the sun god is in a chariot. Just like Helios, but like he's waving at parrots. Okay, that's like something's changed there. There are no parrots in the Eurasian steppe. So like Indians have like changed. So I think like, because like Indians will sometimes argue with me, like, we're just as ancient. I'm like, yeah, but it's like a little different. Because the Chinese, it's like a Chinese person from the Shang dynasty is genetically very similar to a modern Chinese person. And the Shang dynasty, the oracle bones, those characters, is the ancestor of modern Pinyin. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
It is remarkable. Yeah, it's amazing. So this brings me to a question which is controversial right now because of the new Cleopatra, I guess, movie on Netflix.
Get me canceled for the 30th time.
Yeah, that's the point of this podcast, man. What did Cleopatra look like? Because people are upset that Egyptians are upset that she's being portrayed by a black woman, and not even a particularly dark-skinned
she's a mixed race British black woman.
Yeah. So what did she look like?
Yeah, well, we know what she looked like because there was a bust that was created when she was being held. I think that was when she was held hostage in Rome under Caesar. And there's like coins. She looked like a Balkan woman. I think there's like records of her having maybe auburnish hair. She had like a big nose, like not necessarily even a Roman nose, but just like a big nose. Just, pretty Balkan features. Most of her ancestry, we know what it is. She's Macedonian, Greco-Macedonian is maybe the way you want to say it. And then she has a little bit of Iranian ancestry through her Seleucid and Pontic
And to
lineage.
this point, would she look more like a person from that region today? Or
she would look like a person from Greece. I think she would look like a person from Greece.
Like
honestly.
a woman from Greece.
Yeah, I mean, 80% of the ancestry in the Levant dates to 1800 BC. I'm saying 1800 BC very specifically because there are some ancient DNA remains from the port of Sidon, and you take those people and you like substitute them into modern Middle Eastern people, and it's like 80%. Okay, 20% is new stuff. So that's why I say numbers like this and with specific dates. We have ancient DNA. I have a date. I give you a date, and I give you the percentage based on the calculation, right?
Yeah.
And so. But the issue with Cleopatra is like it's not controversial. She's known. This is just American ideology infecting history. The reason I get angry about it is like there's a lot of history we don't know, and there's history we do know. This is history we really know. She's just making stuff up.
Yeah.
And like most people, you want to say like, oh well, they'll know the truth. Like they don't know the truth. And a lot of the Afro-Centric stuff, the Hoteps stuff, is starting to like bleed into the regular discourse, and it's like. I don't really care. Like if like you can think whatever you want to think, like you shouldn't take it seriously, right? But then like intelligent people are taking it seriously now.
Right.
So it's like, what do we do about this? So the Egyptians they know that she's Macedonian too. Like they have a whole history. And I have a post about ancient Egyptian DNA. Basically, like modern Egyptians, like they're mostly from ancient Egypt. They have a lot more sub-Saharan African ancestry than they did in the past. And that's because the Islamic period brought in a lot of that.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And then there's also some northern ancestry, like the Mamelukes were mostly Kipchak Turks and Circassians. But
Yeah. So, I mean, I remember, I think people got upset when Zoe Saldana was tapped to play, was it Nina Simone?
Yes. Yes.
Right. And I understood that because she looks nothing like Nina Simone. Like she was just like, Nina Simone was a dark-skinned black woman.
It's not true to the spirit of who Nina Simone was.
Right. And like, just as a viewer, I do want to see somebody that really looks like I mean, that's part of the suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
It's like I go to a movie theater, I go to a show. You're asking me to suspend my disbelief that this is Nina Simone for a few hours, and that becomes more difficult if she doesn't look anything like Nina Simone. So I understand where the Egyptians are coming from. Like, they want someone that looks like what we know Cleopatra may have looked like, and if you don't have that, it's more difficult to enjoy the show. And look, is there some aspect of colorism to this, of like Arabs not liking the darker skinned? Probably.
Yeah, probably.
Almost certainly.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we should rewrite history based on, current ideology. I really think you should try to be faithful to what people look like in these movies.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to lean towards that. I will say that I don't really care about the new Bridgerton thing.
What's the new Bridgerton thing?
It's like the Queen.
Is it the Netflix show?
Yeah.
They have black people in the show, right?
Yeah, and like basically Queen. So okay, this is a thing that started on the internet, the early internet. So Queen Charlotte of, I think, like, her title is like something of Mecklenburg. She's a German princess. But some of her, like, there was an internet rumor that she was black. And she does have like a Portuguese ancestry, like in 1300. But anyway, but she wasn't black. Okay, there's like one photo. There's one painting that looks African features, but like no one ever described her like that. I mean, she lived 200 years ago, and there's plenty of other paintings. So it's like, it's just made up. Okay, but no one cares about Queen Charlotte in the United States. No one's ever going to look her up. Like, no one's actually going to. There are people who think that, yes, Queen Charlotte was black. Like, this is big in the Hotep community, I think. But the reality is, she's just not historically important. So I don't care. Like, it's just not something that I'm going to like freak out about. It's Bridgerton. Right. Everyone knows there weren't black and Indian people in Regency area. You know what I'm saying? The Regency area aristocracy. Like, it's just some weird fantasy.
Somehow changing it completely is less upsetting than getting it slightly wrong.
That's true, because when you change it completely, you understand you're in like a fantasy alternative right now. Totally. But with the Cleopatra thing, it's a docuseries.
Yeah.
And, they're like portraying it as, like her family was black, I guess, like from the pictures that I've seen. And whatever, it's not that big of a deal, but it's annoying. And it's also an issue where it's like the media knows. They're just not going to call them out on it because, you don't want to be. So like a couple of years ago, like 4 or 5 years ago, Vox.com explained that Cleopatra might have been black because there was a tomb that might have been her sister in Asia Minor. And it could be that her sister was black based on the remains. Now, they made this, first of all, it's not actually conclusive that it's her sister anyway. This is really funny. They concluded that she was black based on the skull science. Like, literal skull science.
Based on phrenology.
Yeah, because I clicked through because I'm like, how would they say this? But it's literally like, and like, that's not always wrong.
So you're saying Vox is pro-phrenology? In
certain contexts. No, but I mean, it's like it's all about like the means and the ends, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important if you're a scientist, if you're a scholar, the truth matters, and it doesn't matter if you hurt the feelings of the people that you're ideologically aligned with. But that's just not very. That's not like people still like pay lip service to it. But let's get real. I mean, we all saw what happened during COVID. People like flipped and changed around based on the coalitions. It's history. No one cares about history. I mean, I care, but I'm not normal. Yeah. No one cares. They're going to lie.
Right.
They'll lie straight to your face. Yeah. I mean, that happens in the Indian context that happened. It was like when it was quite clear that there was like an Indo-Aryan migration from the genetic data, the Indian media.
So tell me, why does this upset some people in the Indian community?
Because there was a theory. So there's a couple of things. One thing is the British colonialists realized that the languages of southern India, about 25% in the Republic of India now, are Dravidian. They labeled them Dravidian. They're not Indo-Aryan. They're not Indo-European. And it's quite clear when you listen to them. But you look at they're not Indo-European, okay? And so they're like, oh, okay, well, like you guys aren't any more close to the people in the north, and then it turns out the people in the north are descended from Aryans, so they're different people. So there's no like real India. It's just something that was like made up, and we can like rule you because like and stuff like that.
Because there's lots of natural divisions going on here,
language,
they would tell, culture, etc.
And they would tell like upper caste northern Indians, what like we're actually Aryans like you, and we're actually not aliens, like we're all Indo-European. And Indians actually bought into this. They thought that their ancestors were from like the Arctic and all this stuff. And actually it turned out that part is not false. Okay. But in any case, in terms of that's where like the Shintoshta were like in the Urals, like it was cold. But in any case, and so what happened is like the Chinese, the Indians now kind of like the regnant ideology, partly related to Hindu nationalists, although this is like very new to Hindu nationalists themselves. The Hindu nationalists had no problem with the Aryan invasion theory for a while. But a new thing is like, well, actually, no, we were always here. And then everyone's the same and we're indigenous and all this stuff and the stuff like, and like, it doesn't make any sense because like that means Indo-Europeans have to come from India. Why is there no genetic Indian ancestry like all over the world? Why is it like European like ancestry in India, et cetera? It doesn't really make any sense. But I did see Indian scientists straight up saying that, and the Indian media. I mean, media is like they're dumb. They don't know what's going on. They just like the science says. So what the scientist says is what science says. So they're gonna say it. So they just like straight up like lie. Because like people would email me, they're like, "Wait, that's not what the paper says." I'm like, exactly. But nobody knows. They don't care. So I feel a lot. Seeing that happen in India, I'm a lot less judgmental about other cultures. After also like things in America where it's like I'll give you like I'll tell you guys like a funny story because like I think it was like 2012. I don't think I was maybe it was earlier. I don't think I was in grad school yet. So Ta-Nehisi, back when he was still engaged with comments,
Ta-Nehisi Coates,
on the Atlantic, he was like talking about race, and I was just like, "What? You should like talk to a scientist." And so I recommended Neil Risch. And Neil Risch is, and he's emeritus, so I can say this, and he's not going to get mad, although people still get mad. I'm going to say this. He published a bunch of papers in the early 2000s that you can like identify someone's racial identity with not that many markers, very easy, like 30 markers.
30 genetic markers.
Yeah, like population informative discriminative markers, but you can do it with 30.
But you have to pick the 30 carefully.
Yeah, because they have to be the ones that are very genetically distinct.
Right.
But he just published some papers. There were some StatGen papers, and he just showed like, look. Like population structure is real. It's easy to figure out. Blah blah blah. And so, in like 20 years ago, that was basically race has a biological component. And that was what he made a big. I mean, he's very old and he's very eminent. He's done a lot of other things. I don't want to overemphasize it. But anyway, so I recommended Neil, and like Ta-Nehisi reached out to Neil. Neil like talked to him. You read Neil's interview, he's like being totally PC. I was like, oh, okay. I see how this goes. It doesn't matter like how famous and how established you are. You're just going to tell them what they want to hear. And like multiple people like Zach Beecham, I don't know if he's still at Vox where he is, but I got into an argument with him once where I was like, well, not all geneticists think race has no biological basis. He's like, well, did you see the Ta-Nehisi interview with Neil Risch? And I'm like, well, I recommended Neil Risch. So but I'm just saying,
he lied to Ta-Nehisi.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe some people criticize me for saying lying, but I'm just like, he told Ta-Nehisi what Ta-Nehisi wanted to hear. It's quite clear. Like he just couldn't. My point was like there is.
Is this at the point when Ta-Nehisi was really a big deal?
Not yet.
Not quite yet.
Yeah,
right?
but he was still. I mean, if he was like listening to me, he wasn't a big deal.
Right. Right.
So, but I mean, my point
Don't
is
sell
like,
yourself short.
No, I mean this was a long time ago. But yeah, I mean, I'm just saying like he wouldn't respond to my emails now.
Right.
And I just was like, look it up. But whatever. It is what it is. And I still do my own thing, but like the rest of the world has agreed on certain different things. Let's put it this way. Like, scientists are way more, woke wasn't a thing like 15 years ago.
Right.
So whatever it is, the truth is what it is. And like, it'll all come back eventually.
Right.
So I don't know.
Well, I think I know some people find this whole line of discussion to be taboo and suspect. But I think I don't think there's much to fear here if responsible people are curious about history and migrations and population genetics and so forth. And really the totality, I don't want to be glib because this stuff can be used to divide people, and it is, but just as much it can be used to show us how much we have in common. And really reading your Substack, one does not get the sense of a divided humanity. One gets the sense of an ultra complicated human story going back thousands of years. And that's why it's really interesting for me to read. And I highly recommend other people read it too. It's called Unsupervised Learning, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So Razib Khan, Unsupervised Learning. And then before I let you go, can you just talk a little bit about your startup?
Yeah.
What are you doing at your startup? What's it called, et cetera?
So thanks. So, this is most of my time I actually do spend at the startup. It's just like, it's a platform as a service, business to business. So, it's not one of those like sexy public facing things. So, we talked about 23andMe and Ancestry. They use genotype arrays right now. And so the 23andMe is like 600,000 markers. Ancestry is like an 800,000 marker. So these are Illumina arrays. Okay. So these are like chips. You put the sample on and it returns positions at these markers. So these markers are variable markers. They're very informative, but the whole genome is 3 billion base pairs. Okay. So it's 3 billion and you're only getting, less than 1 million out of that, right? And that's still a lot of information, but my belief, and so I've been whole genome sequenced. You can find it, just type Razib Khan whole genome sequence onto Google. You can like look at all the raw data. I put it out there. My older son is the first human who was sequenced before he was born. You can like Google MIT Tech Review Razib Khan, like that was profiled in 2014. So I'm a really enthusiast for genetics and personal genomics and like genomics, like what it's going to do for our future. But the issue is with data. So the first human genome was $3 billion to sequence in today's money. Right now, you can get a medical grade whole genome sequence like you could for $200. Okay. So the price point has really come down. So we've gone from one genome 20 years ago, one human genome, to probably around 1 million. It's hard to keep track of. Now it's so like commoditized. So we have 1 million, right? But what's like, to be cliche, what's more informative than 1 million genomes? 1 billion genomes, right? We're going to get there. But how are we going to store it? How are we going to analyze it? So a lot of the data storage rubrics or maxims for like, a dozen genomes don't really apply to thousands of genomes. This is starting to get some serious, there's going to be, as of like, I think the NIH predicted that next year there's going to be more genomic data in the world than there was data on the internet in 2010. Wow. Right. So it's like we're getting into like petabytes. It's crazy. So how do we manage this? Obviously, I like what genomics can tell us about the past, which can do massive amounts. I think it'll be able to tell us a lot about ourselves. You talked about some interesting, funny things, right? But this stuff is going to get serious soon. Already, like babies, newborns that don't flourish, they're sequencing them, and 40% of the time they can figure out a congenital problem because they obviously can't tell you what their problem is, right? So this is going to get really actionable and serious and ubiquitous. So you have all this data. My company Generate. What we want to do is make obviously the data storage and management easy, accessible to scientists, and then also the analysis. We want to make them rewarding, rich, and also easy. Because a lot of these things, this is a field where, genomic sequencing cost beat Moore's Law for 7 straight years. So it's gotten so fast that
Moore's Law being that the price comes down by how much every?
I think it's like, is it every year it goes down by half?
Something like that.
Yeah. And so basically genomics outran computing for a while. And so it's really hard to manage the data, analyze the data. So one of the reasons that I believe we are not where we should be when it comes to medical prediction and all these things is just because like geneticists, we were not trained with the mindset and the tools to analyze big data. Like a lot of people that are, like Gen X or older, were trained on Excel. Yes, the younger millennials and Zoomers, some of them are trained on, using Python, databases and like in SQL databases, but not too many. And so this is just a situation where our culture has not matched what our technology. We have the technology, but we don't have the culture. We don't have the skills. So what Generate wants to do is make a lot of that easier. We want to have a platform for people to do science, so they mostly focus on science instead of information technology. And this is not super exciting on one level, right? Like I was talking about like, the ancient history of Madagascar or the, whatever, all of these things that we're talking about, controversial things. But this sort of stuff, nuts and bolts, is what's going to make it so that we can actually have the genetic future that was promised 20 years ago, right? So there were a lot of promises made. A lot of it has not panned out. We have not cured cancer. So let's talk about cancer. A third of us are going to have cancer and die of cancer, okay? I mean, if we had lived forever for 120 years, it would be a higher percentage, right? But cancer are mutations in your cells. So Steve Jobs was one of the first people that had cancer genomics done on him. It was super expensive then. It's pretty cheap now. So yes, there's one whole genome sequence for you right now. And that's like one and done. But if you have cancer and they need to like do tissue sampling and stuff, they're going to have to like sample multiple times. And so the data needs are going to be really big. But we shouldn't have to think about that. We shouldn't have to think about data needs as a limitation. You know, and so there's a lot of companies. My company, Generate, is one of them. There's other companies getting into the space. There's some of the big boys getting in. Amazon has a good genomics unit. But you know what? To anyone out there who has like a biotech company, good luck getting Amazon to do work for you, because like they're looking at big farm, you know? So like big companies like Amazon, they want to work with massive companies. They want to work probably with like 6 big companies, you know, and make a bunch of money off that. We're here to service like the smaller companies that still have needs, but that don't want to hire like an IT tech team, you know?
Right.
So, you know, increased productivity, more science, brighter future, all of those Silicon Valley things. I'm all about that. And, you know, we have a lot of the technology already. Can you imagine what it's going to be like when we have like, you know, like you could just like take a sequence yourself and like put it in with a thumb drive into your computer? I mean, that's going to happen probably in 10 to 15 years. I predict it will.
Yeah, it's amazing. I just realized there's some question I want to ask you. I forgot to. Does epigenetics mean that intergenerational trauma is a real thing?
No, I wrote a whole thing.
I know you did.
I have friends who I have friends in academia who do not tell people that they work on epigenetics anymore because they are sick of having to deal with the questions because it's all misleading from the media. And so they just say that they work on gene regulation. So no. So epigenetic trauma is basically something happens to you and it's passed down genetically to your offspring. There's really no evidence for this in humans. There is some evidence for they're called insults, that these things can happen in plants and maybe in certain types of mice, but there's no evidence in humans. Epigenetics is a massive deal. Like that's why like, you know, like your cells are different in your nose versus your liver, right? It's actually like,
because each cell has a full copy of the genome. So which part turns on to tell this to be a liver cell as opposed to a bone cell? Yeah. So epigenetics is this whole molecular biological process that's a really big deal. And that's why so many people study it. Because stuff like cancer also happens through epigenetic modifications and mutations, right? Epimutations or whatever. So it's a massive deal. But what people really want to care about is like, oh, like there was a famine in the Netherlands in 1945 and the grandchildren are sicker. And that probably, honestly, most people in the field think that that's probably publication bias, where it's just like, yes, it's not, they didn't do anything fraudulent, but randomly some things will just happen with the p-values, you guys know, right? So yes, I have a post about it. If you have a 95% confidence interval, that means 5% of the time something's going to just be wacky by chance, right? And you really like the p-values for some of these big data fields. Like for example, in genomics for genome-wide associations, which like detect the Mendelian diseases that you're talking about, the real p-value is like, you know, rule of thumb is like 10 to the negative 8. Okay. You know? Yeah. So it's just like the 0.05 is not even applicable there. So yeah, I have a post. It's free. You guys should check it out. December. I wrote about epigenetics. I wrote not because I have a passion for debunking public myths, but because like I did it as a service because I heard so many complaints privately. Yeah. And you know, so, I mean, yeah, maybe someday I'll write a book, by the way, if I have time after the startup. Like, so Steven Pinker was like, you know, telling me, he's on my podcast too, but I have a podcast as well. But yeah, so Steven was like giving me a hard time about that after we were done. About not writing a book? Yeah, and I was just like, you know, when I have the time, bro. And then like, but he did say. I mean, I think if a book, well, go on. He said but he did say the epigenetics piece, like he said that to everybody because he was like, I was thinking about writing something like this and you already did it. So I was like really happy. No, I mean, it would be great to have a book just about population genetics overturning all these things we thought were true about history. Yeah. Right. That just like that would be awesome. Okay. So my last question, which will probably make me seem like an idiot, but I just want to get your potted quick response to this. When people say we share 97% of our genes with a banana, right? They also say you share 50% of your genes with your sister. Yeah, yeah. How can this be true? Yeah, so we must mean it in two different senses. So can you like explain that? Yeah. So I have a post on this, by the way, for anyone here. I think that July 30th or something of. Anyway, it has like chimpanzee or something in the title. I have a post on this from July of 2022. Last year. But in any case, I'll explain it really quickly. Yeah. Okay, so when they say you're 97, like 99% like a chimpanzee, what they're actually doing is they're looking at the 3 billion ACGs and Ts, and they're doing like a comparison with the other 3 billion, approximately. Like there's slight differences in the sizes, but basically just doing a one-to-one comparison positionally, right? Of each
Exactly.
specific.
And so like the sequence identity is very close. I don't think it's 99. I think it's less than that. But whatever. It's around there. Okay.
Yeah.
But when they say you're 50% related to your sister, that means, okay, if you do like a comparison, you're actually like 99.9% identical to your sister. But that 50% is assigned to the genomic segments that physically came down from one set of your parents. Does that make sense? So your 50% of your genes are from one of your parents, okay? There's recombination, and so I'll make it concrete. My daughter is 30% my dad, 20% my mom. It's because recombination made it so that there was more of my dad's genes that went into my daughter. My son is like closer to 25. And so that's the variation where like that's why you're not 100% obviously, and then 50% is the average because you're getting like a 50% sampling from each parent, right? But that doesn't refer to what the state of the genome is. The genome, the strands are actually much more similar than that. But it's just like if you had labels of strands of like maternal and paternal grandparents, what it's doing is it's like those are labeled as different. That's called identity by descent. And this is actually not a stupid question. It's a common question.
Even if some of the specific nucleotides are actually identical,
the vast majority
in those
are.
two.
The vast majority are, because most humans are identical.
Right.
But what they're doing is looking at identity by state, and with like something like 23andMe, you can look across the genome, and so let's say like 1% of you. This is way underestimate, but let's just say 1%, or it's an overestimate. 1% of your genomes differ from your sister. But what you could do is like if you look across the segment, you can see where the mutations are, and if the pattern of mutations will tell you if the two segments are matching. Right? So when you look across a long enough strand, you can figure it out enough differences that you can tell who the strand came from. So it's quite clear that it's from like your maternal grandfather as opposed to your maternal grandmother. Right. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
That's a good question.
All right. Well, that's all I have for you. Razib, thank you so much for coming on my show.
That was my pleasure, man.
And we're done.
All right.